welcome to another episode of IT Audit Simplified. And today we will be talking about access controls in ITGC. Now, if you're preparing for CISA or if you're learning IT Audit, then access controls are one of the most important areas in ITGCs. In this video, I'll explain access controls in a very simple way with real audit examples so that you actually understand them. So let's get started. So in the last video, we talked about ITGCs, which are also called General IT Controls or GITCs. Now, these general IT, these general ITCs, they apply to all the systems. These controls apply to all the systems. And today we will be talking about access controls. Now, what is access control? Access controls are about making sure that the right people, who can do what. Basically, that the right people have access to the right system at the right time. So, in terms of who can do what, who is like which person has access, and what is basically what kind of access they have, what actions they can take, what activities they have access to. From a CISA perspective, these access controls ensure that only authorized users, they have access to the system and also the data. Now, think of it like this. There's a user has access to the system, and that system has the data, the financially relevant data, which is again like used to prepare like the financial statements or like acts as like a auxiliary system, right? But if a user has access to the system which already has that data, if it's not the right user, then they could have access to sensitive data, which is again a really, really big risk. These access controls make sure that the correct user has access to the right IT system, the right application. They make sure that the user is authorized. If the user is not authorized, then they would have access to the sensitive data, which is again a big, big risk. Now, why does it matter? If the access is not properly controlled, a lot can actually go wrong. Now, unauthorized users might get access to sensitive data. Think of it like this. Like you have a company, Amazon, and Amazon has a user called Mr. Smith who works in a warehouse. Now, if Mr. Smith works in a warehouse and he has access to payroll data or payroll information, then that is incorrect because he should not have access to sensitive data, right? He should not have access to systems like AWS. Now, if there were access-based controls in place, then there would be checks performed to ensure or minimize the risk of a user like Mr. Smith having access to payroll data. Like we talked about it before, the user needs to be appropriate in order to get access to relevant IT system that provides access to sensitive data. Now let's go down. So far we saw that because of having these access-based controls, the risk of errors or even frauds can be reduced, which is why access-based controls are very, very critical. Now let's talk about some of the access controls. Now, access control, think of it like an umbrella. Let me write it again real quick. So access is like an umbrella. There's like a lot of different controls within these niche. Okay, they're like around, I would say, 5 to 6 controls, but depending on like how you see. The first one is authentication. Very, very important, very, very important from the CISA perspective. Authentication is basically the controls that verify the identity of the user before giving access. Um, Authentication, it's also called passwords control, or also called logon controls, right? It's basically it's the first step as to how a user is authenticated into the system. How do they access the system, right? It could be, using passwords. There's a policy that defines the different password criteria. Um, and another one is basically like MFA, and sometimes like single sign-on or SSO. Um, these authentication controls verify the identity of the user before they give access. So, for example, like for MFA, it could be like more than just password. So, like multiple ways of authenticating. It could be the OTP, which is one time password. You guys must also have heard of RSA codes, which is again like a system generated code that you have to enter. It's like tokens that are assigned to like users, and once that token is only active for like, let's say, 30 seconds. But again, we'll be talking about that in detail later. But for now, just remember that authentication is one of the controls. um, this control help verify the identity of the user before giving access to the system. All right, so next we're going to be talking about another type of control, which is called user provisioning, which is similar to how access is granted to a user. Now, typically, this is for new users. Let's say if you have a new user in a company, how access is granted to that user. It's very important how the access is granted to that user. Typically, in user provisioning, the companies have a system in place where a service now ticket is being generated, and then someone like the manager um, requests opens that ticket, and a request is created for a particular role that has to be assigned to a user. And then, very, very important is the approval process, where approvals have to be obtained prior to the access being granted to the new user. For example, if the access is given without proper approval, then that becomes a control issue. So obtaining approval prior is very, very important, and this is a really relevant control in the IT system. So if the controls are in place, then it really reduces the risk that, a user who should not have access to the system is granted access to a particular IT system, again, that houses or stores financially relevant data. So first, we talked about passwords, authentication, which is how user enter into the system. And second, we talked about provisioning, where how new users are granted access into the system. Now, similar to user provisioning, there's another control called user deprovisioning. But let me tell you something. User provisioning is typically for new users. A subset of this is also like granting access to like um, users who move to another department, but that is something we'll cover later. So first, let's talk about user deprovisioning, which is also called user terminations, which is basically like removing access from a user, revoking their access. It could be like for multiple reasons. It could be that, an employee is leaving the company, right? Which is why um, their access needs to get removed. Or a user was demoted right, in a company, and hence their access needs to get removed. So it could be any number of reasons, but basically, user terminations or deprovisioning control, which is opposite to user provisioning control, it's about removing the access. So in user deprovisioning, the, the role of the user is changed, right? That the role may be they got transferred to another department, right? Or anything. Um, Basically, their access, particular access or particular role which they had before, they do not need that role anymore, and hence their role should be removed. For example, if there was a person who worked in supply chain and now they work in HR, right? So their access from supply chain needs to get removed and they should be granted access to the HR systems, correct? So in this case, you know, then there's a risk if they still have access to the supply chain system. And hence, there are controls in place which help us reduce that risk. All right, we talked about provisioning before and we talked about deprovisioning, and we do have a few more controls. Okay, so let's talk about number 4. Just user access reviews. User access reviews, it's also called UAR. All right, it is that it's basically based on the principle that access should not just be granted and forgotten, right? Reviews over all the users need to be performed. You have to check um, you have to check the different roles, like the different users, um, and what kind of access they have. Now, it could be periodic, which could be annual, like once a year, semi-annual, twice a year, quarterly. Now, this really depends, like how the frequency of reviews kind of like depends on sensitive data. If that application has sensitive data, the total number of people who have access to the system, if the application is like a risky application, like it's not properly configured, things like that. That really like depends on, how frequently reviews have to be performed. Now, let's take an example. In UARs, typically like a user listing is generated from the IT system that tells us, okay, um, who are the users and who have access to the system, and then a reviewer or like manager might go in and check, perform a review, over all the access of users within the system. Users who should not have access anymore, then it goes through a process where their roles are revoked. That those users, either they're removed or their particular roles are revoked, which means they will not have access to the system anymore. For example, there's a contractor in the company, and he has access to a particular IT system which he should not have access to, or maybe he left, maybe his contract was over, right? How do you catch that is when you're performing the user access reviews. Now, um, you might say that based on like the frequency, like we talked about, annual, could be semi-annual, it could be quarterly, which is once every 3 months, um and it could be monthly, but I really haven't seen a lot of monthly cases. It's mostly like either annual or like quarterly, most for the most part. um Again, just to sum it up, user access reviews are basically that review over all of the users um, within a particular IT system. And then let's go up a little bit. All right. Yeah, we covered that already. Okay, good. So yeah, we covered user access reviews. The next control is privileged access. which is basically like for privileged access. Users might have access to like sensitive roles um, within an IT system. It's also called like elevated access control, where, or it could be like called like admin control. Where basically we are looking at users who have more access than other people. Um, Users who have privileged access, users who can do, who have access to like change permissions, who have more access to, more functions, which is like more, which kind of like creates more risk, right? um, it could be that those users, especially for those high level access users. For example, you have Mr. John who has admin access, and as part of admin access, you know, he can either, for example, like in SAP, as an admin, he can change what other users have access to. Like he has access to override the roles and what kind of systems within SAP, what kind of different modules the users might have access to. Let's say he can change data, right? He can override controls, right? He can override some of the activities, some of the data, some of the logs, right? Which again kind of like is a privileged access. You can also assign roles to users. Again, this needs to be monitored. This high level access, especially like for new users, for like for example, Mr. John grants access to a new user and within SCP, and he assigns role to it. Like someone needs to look at what Mr. John is doing as part of his privileged access. Because his access is elevated, he has admin access. Like for all these types of access, a review should be performed by looking at, okay, what are the different activities these users are doing. So review of all of these users should be done on a timely basis and in a good frequency, depending on how frequently privileged access reviews like PAR are being done. So review is really important. Then a log, and as well as permission. So in terms of log, it could be, okay, if Mr. Smith logged into the system as an admin, what kind of changes he made. Look at all the different changes he made as part of his access, and what kind of permissions or role Mr. Smith has, what kind of things he can do that's privileged. So there should be stricter controls for monitoring. Hmm. Now, let me tell you an example. So, there's another concept of generic IDs or generic accounts, which are risky because they can like reduce accountability. So, for example, there's a common account called admin, right? Right? So, as part of this admin, any user who has access to that particular like permission, they're part of like, let's say, an admin group, they can log in. For example, you have Mr. Taylor and Mr. Taylor and Mr. Singh, right? If you have those two users, and if they have permission to access the admin group, then using their password, they can log in as admins. Understood? Which is why it becomes difficult to track, you know, who is actually performing. For example, Mr. John, you know, he and then you have Mr. Smith, right? Now they're performing, they both have access to admin roles. And for example, like Mr. John is changing the role for 10 users. Mr. Smith is also some performing some kind of like admin role. So let me go up. Now here, if he, for both of them, we have to look at the logs. For both of them, we have to look at different permissions they have access to, because you wouldn't know who made the change, right? Mr. John or Mr. Smith. So that is why for generic accounts, there's another risk, because it kind of like reduces accountability. It becomes difficult to track who actually performed an action, right? Like we discussed about generic accounts, any of the users who are assigned to a particular group would have access to that particular account. In this case, a generic ID like system support user, admin user, like any of these generic accounts. So there's another concept called SOD, which stands for segregation of duties, where it kind of like dictates that a user should not review their own access, which is very, very important. And this concept is applicable for a bunch of different controls. So it's basically like you have a user, right, Mr. Smith, and Mr. Smith, if he's looking at the user listing, he should not approve his own access. So you have application owners, for example, for SCP. In this case, like he's like the manager. Think of it like this: like he's the application owner or the manager. And if he's performing a review for quarter 1 of 2026, and in that listing he has his own name, right? But it wouldn't make sense like that he's reviewing his own access saying that, oh, you know what, my access is correct, right? Which doesn't make sense. Hence, segregation of duties is not enforced in this case. So one person should not have control or should not kind of like review their own access, or they should not control their own access, which really helps us to reduce the risk of frauds and errors. Now let's go up a little bit. Um, go a little bit up. Look at all the controls we talked about. Yeah, so we started with access controls, which is like authentication or passwords. That's the first control, how users logs into the system. Next one is user provisioning, is basically how the access is granted, for especially for like new users. There's no ticket being created and then approvals are obtained prior to the access being given. Yeah, like here we talked about like snow and like the reducing risk. Yeah, the third one is user deprovisioning, opposite to user provisioning, where how the access is removed, right? Once a user leaves the company or if his role is changed, like here. And we talked about this in detail as well. One of the really important controls. We talked about how to reduce risk when a person transfers into another department as well. The fourth one was user access reviews, which is basically a review of all the users in an IT application or in an IT system. This is generally done periodically, annually, semi-annually, quarterly, basically looking at the all the users as well as the different roles they have within an IT system. And over here, like you look at all the users, and if a person's access needs to be removed, it is removed. All right, the next one was privileged access. We talked about admin access, elevated access. A review needs to be performed over the different users who have access, what kind of access they have, as well as the list of the log or the activity tracker, what changes they made in the system. We talked about this as well. Another concept we talked about was generic IDs, which is basically like a particular user group, let's say admin user group, and just looking at, okay, who performed what, again, a log review, because any of the users can perform activities, especially using a generic ID. So we would not be able to track who did what, and this really helps us enforce and introduce like accountability. Next one was segregation of duties, which is basically a user should not be reviewing his or her own access. This really helps us maintain, have a second opinion and checking of work, like person is not doing the work and also approving his or her own work. We talked about a few examples for all of them. Well, I guess that was a gist of all the access-based controls. We'll be taking a deeper dive into each of these in the coming videos. This is really important from the CISA perspective. I really hope you learned a lot. This could, it could be like, oh, it's too much, but again, we'll be talking about it in the upcoming videos. Um, Let me know if you want me to make other videos on different controls. Talked about access in this one. Again, we'll be talking more detail. The next one is change management, which is another GITC. And the third one is computer operations or also operations. Again, we test the ITGCs applicable to all of the systems. We'll be covering that in the next videos. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Let me know if you have any questions in the comment section or the next videos you want me to make you. And all right, I'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much. Bye bye.